Hello, FlameCon. It's Anthony, one of your hosts for today's festivities. Just want to get people in here. Yeah, this is exciting. We're doing the thing from home for the first time ever. I'm like all by myself out on the digital world stage. But hey, this is going to be cute. This is going to be fun. We're going to do this together. We've got people from around the world tuning in. And to our first workshop on a spotlight for creators of queer kid comics. Let's get this thing started. I want them to have the most time to talk about that. So I would like to introduce the moderator for our panel, Gina.
Hey everyone, I'm Gina Gagliano. I am delighted to be here and also delighted to be the moderator of this panel talking about queerness and kids comics and what's going on in the kids comics field today. I'm the publishing director of Random House Graphic, which is a kids and YA publisher dedicated to graphic novels. So it's a great space to be working in and a very queer-friendly space, which is why I'm so excited to do this panel. So I'm going to start out by having the panelists come in and then they'll introduce themselves and tell us about who they are and what their books are. Hey everyone.
Hello.
Hi.
I think wait a minute, we're still missing one panelist who has gone astray. So give us a second to get her back and then we'll start off with introductions. Okay, perhaps we'll start off with introductions and then she will miraculously appear, which will be great. Kat, do you want to start off, tell us about you and a little about your latest book?
Sure. My name is Kat Leyh, and I had a book called Snapdragon come out this past February, featuring a number of queer characters.
Trung, what about you?
My name is Trung, and I have a book coming out in October called The Magic Fish through Random House Graphic. So it'll be out on October 13th, and it's about navigating queerness intergenerationally within an immigrant family.
Mike, what about you?
Hey, I'm Mike Curato. This is my debut graphic novel, Flamer, and it is about a kid in the 90s at a scout camp the summer before his first year of high school, and he's dealing with a lot of stuff like bullying and racism and body image and questioning his religion, all while confronting his sexual identity. So lots of fun stuff, but there's some jokes too.
That sounds great. It's such a great set of books that you've all written, and they're all have come out or coming out this year, which is just like so many queer comics. It's great.
Oh yeah, I forgot to say it's available September 1st. Sorry.
And it looks like you have a real copy. That's the first real copy.
I know, yeah.
Okay, so my first question for all of you is, what was the first thing that you remember reading that had a queer character in it? And tell us a little about that. Trung, do you want to start off?
Sure. When I was a lot younger, I think I actively sought out queer kind of young adult stories. I loved fantasy, but that tended not to happen just in the fantasy that I encountered, because a lot of the fantasy that I grew up with were books that were kind of layover from like the 50s and 60s that, you know, are really beloved. And I read a lot of C.S. Lewis, and I read the Prydain books. But the first books that I encountered were Rainbow Boys by Alex Sanchez. That was actually quite a quite impactful for me. And he's a Mexican-American author, which I didn't know until I was much older. And so that was kind of like a cool little segment of where queerness existed in fiction for me that actually reflected my experience a little bit. And then since then, all through kind of high school, I didn't really have a lot of queer characters that I encountered in any of my reading.
Kat, what about you?
I have been thinking about that question because I can't really recall the first thing that I read with a queer character in it, or at least not a queer character that I recognized. I was a pretty dense kid, so I needed it spelled out for me. I think probably the first thing I read with queer characters where I knew what was going on was the webcomic You and Me by Rose Larian. It was, I think I discovered queer characters primarily through webcomics and fan fiction and things like that, and nothing officially published for a long time with queer characters.
Oh, we have our last panelist back. Jessi, welcome to the panel. Do you want to introduce yourself and tell us a little about your latest book?
Hi, sorry, my internet is awful. Don't have Comcast. I'm Jessi Zabarsky, and my latest book is, if I can pick it up here, Witchlight, which is a queer adventure fantasy road trip with a lot of nice food and talking deeply about your feelings.
Aw, that's great. Okay. Mike, do you want to talk about the first thing you remember reading that had a queer character in it?
Okay, it took me a while to like try to figure this out. I was like, well, what's like the earliest queer character I can remember? So I've narrowed it down to two books. In high school, reading Moby Dick, I remember there was Queequeg was suspect, right? He was like this kind of like, I forget what it was exactly, but I remember there was talk about like, he might be queer and he might also be the devil. And it's like, whoa, okay, great. Now I like wish I got to know Queequeg better. And I think he's supposed to be like South Asian Pacific Islander or something like that. I'm like, Queequeg, yes, represent. But, and then the other book was the Iliad, right? There's Achilles and Patroclus. And I remember the moment where my English teacher was like, yes, that was my phone, RIP. But my English professor having to explain like, yeah, so they were, you know, if we're reading the text, they were a little more than friends. And people were like, what? Like people were gagged. And I was like, what? So I was having all kinds of ancient Greek fantasies. So anyway, yes, those are the earliest queer characters that I was introduced to, but I don't remember what the first like openly queer character in a book was, which I think says something.
Jessi, what about you?
I think the first book was, and I'm not sure that I actually read it because I was pretty small, and there was a kid's book, a picture book at a library that was like something about a kid having two moms. And like I read the title and I think I only dared to flip through it a little bit because I was like extremely interested, but also I was like, this seems like I'm not allowed to be reading this. This seems dangerous somehow. And it's like, it's at a public library, it's fine. But it was still like, this is forbidden knowledge, this picture book about a child having two mothers.
So I'm also curious about the kinds of queer stories that you as authors are able to tell today, and if there are new kinds of queer stories that you're able to tell today. You know, from listening to you talk about your first queer books, and I know my own experience of reading queer stories as a kid was that every story that I read that had a queer protagonist was a coming out story. All of them were about white boys, and there were many, many tragic endings. So I'm wondering, as you going into being authors today, what different experiences you're having with what kind of stories you can tell. Kat, do you want to start this one off again?
Sure. Yeah, I feel pretty lucky that I've started making comics really in a time where a lot of people before have blazed trails and made it a lot easier for people to tell just about every kind of queer story you can imagine, almost, with plenty of stories left to tell. Obviously, it's less writing queer stories and more just writing whatever kind of story you are interested in, and then also being able to include queer characters in that, because it's your stories aren't being pigeonholed as much as they used to be into like, oh, well, this is a queer story, so it's about being usually, a white, affluent gay boy or something like that.
What about you, Trung?
I think a lot about this question, and I turn it over in my head quite a lot, and I feel many different ways about it. And I do feel strongly that kind of every generation tells the story that it needs and is able to at the time. And so I really appreciate the groundwork that has sort of been laid and can kind of contextualize that there were a lot of limitations, and I'm trying to be understanding about like the nagging feeling of feeling like the adults and the industry and the world around me failed to tell the stories that I needed when I was younger. But we're in such a space now where queerness is not something that is necessarily conflated with trauma, and we don't have to tell stories that edify this like straight public readership anymore. We can tell stories about ourselves and our own experiences that really reflect who we are. And so we can kind of get away from like the Hans Christian Andersen model of like, your longing will destroy you and you will never get what you want, and into more territory about like, what does friendship look like, and what do our relationships with our parents look like, and what does it mean to be a queer member of a community where there may or may not be other queer people immediately around you. And there are so many different aspects to queerness that are no longer kind of siloed into like either, your contentious relationship with your family or your, ill-fated pursuit of queer desire. It can really be about yourself as a whole person living in the world. And I feel like that's kind of where we are in telling queer stories, and I'm very excited about it.
Yeah. What about you, Mike?
Well, I mean, I agree with everything that Kat and Trung have already said, that there can be books now that show intersectionality of queer people, and that there also isn't this binary anymore of like gay or lesbian. There's so much more, and so that's why the stories we can tell are so infinite. And including people of color and showing queer people just being people, being boring. We can be boring too. And also, I think it's really interesting. I mean, all that being said, like my story is very much a quasi coming out and like the perils of homophobia kind of story. But what's really interesting to me, I'm really looking forward to really, really young emerging authors who have a different childhood experience than I do, because I'm curious to read their story of what it's like growing up in an accepting household, and what are they facing that I don't understand. So I'm hoping that we'll just keep hearing different perspectives. That's what the world needs.
Yeah. Jessi, what about you?
I feel like, well, particularly with Witchlight, I went into it, I was making it just as basically single issues at the time. And I just was incredibly selfish about it. I wanted to do it exactly how I wanted to do it. and only for me. And so that's the kind of story and queerness that I wrote. And I think that's significant for the time, because there's, you know, even when I was first starting it, there were enough stories out there, even though there were less back then, that I didn't feel like a huge pressure to like represent everything perfectly, or, you know, to cater to a wider audience really stringently. I was just like, this is the kind of weird folktale fantasy story that I like, and I'm going to pull in all of the queer stuff that I'm interested in talking about. And just kind of like, when I was reading more queer stories in high school, it was very white, very male, but it was also very grounded in reality. It was like, this is a thing that you deal with in American high school. And I was like, that's cool, but also I want to go on a magic adventure. And just like being able to mash those two things together and just be like, okay, what's the next cool thing I want to draw these gay characters doing and seeing and being, is just very fun. And I'm glad other people also like it, because I made it for me.
Mike, I want to expand on something that you brought up, the idea that there's this new generation telling their stories, and they're different from what you or I or maybe all of us as older people, or maybe I don't know, maybe some of us are older and some are younger. I'm not sure. But I'm wondering, are there things in writing for kids today? Are there aspects of queerness that you're addressing that weren't part of your own childhood experience? And how do you research and approach that when you're writing it in your story, when it wasn't part of your life? Mike, do you want to start off?
Actually, I don't know if I'm the best example, because the whole book that I wrote is very much based on my experience. And it's set in the 90s. So it's like, well, like, that's how it was. I know because I was there. But so I didn't have to do a lot of research. But that being said, I think there are a lot of things, even though it was, I don't want to say how long ago, but yeah, there's a lot of numbers ago. Since 1995, I think there are still situations that are relevant today. Obviously, racism, still a big problem. Homophobia is still a big problem. Toxic masculinity, definitely a problem. You know, so there are themes that have been inherited, but also, I guess, in thinking about the audience, I mean, like Jessi, I wrote this book for myself, but also I was trying to think, you know, what was I lacking at that age? Like, what did I need? And I needed to see myself in pages and on screens. There was nothing, I couldn't see myself in the world. And so I started to wonder if I should be in it. So I think that's the important message that I wanted to get across, was like, you know, you're okay, you're good, you're here, take up some space. I'm not sure if that answered the question, but.
Yeah, Jessi, what about you?
Let's see here. I think mostly what wasn't addressed, you know, in my childhood experience was just like, I've always felt normal, that like all of the media with queer characters that I grew up reading or consuming, you know, cast the queer characters as like they feel this inherent otherness, like I'm, and that was like, mostly they were feeling societal pressure. But I just kind of grew up not really feeling that. And that like kind of made me double take my own queerness of like, wait, I feel normal. So am I straight, or like what's going on? So that's something that I indulge a lot in my comics writing, of just like, this is commonplace, that it's just, there's no big reveals really. It's not a shock to anyone. It's just like, yeah, I mean, kissing, whatever.
Yeah. Kat, what about you?
For Snapdragon, I definitely did a lot of reading, although they're all topics that I already had an interest in and would read about a lot as well. So like trans youth specifically, and queer history, which not a lot of us know because we don't usually come up surrounded by others in our community who can teach us those things. So the onus is kind of on us to learn about our own history. And the history that most of us get is through fictional work or famous tragedies. And so there's always this idea that in the past, being gay, being queer was dangerous and sad. And what I wanted to have in my book were all the conflicts that the various characters had. I didn't want the conflicts to come from their queerness. So I have, it's a little spoilery, but I have a queer interracial couple who are together through like the 50s and 60s. And it would be very easy to have all of the tension in their story to be about their interracial relationship or about the fact that they're both women. But the reality is there was a lot more examples of people just living their full lives as queer individuals in the past. And what I wanted to do was research a lot about that and put a lot of that into the story about how they're the very boring stories about people in the, women in the early 1900s who just lived as lesbians together and grew old and nothing really remarkable ever happened to them. So they didn't make the news. So people don't hear about them. And there are examples like that throughout the world and throughout history. We just don't generally get told those stories. So that's kind of something that I really wanted to have in this story. It's like it actually is possible. Like it was dangerous, but there actually are examples of people that were just like, live their boring queer lives.
That's great. Trung, what about you?
I think I have a similar bent to Kat as well, where I wanted to tell stories that were that didn't center queerness in any kind of tension, really. Like the crux of my story in The Magic Fish is that there's not really, the conflict does not lie in whether or not these family members will still love each other in spite of queerness. The conflict lies in how do we tell each other that we care about each other when we lack the language for such a specific issue and such specific identities that we don't really quite know how to navigate between a language barrier. Like that, to have a baseline of your family cares about you and we want to support you in a particular way was something that I really needed when I was younger. But I kind of feel like that is sort of the center of a lot of my stories, is that there's a baseline of care and compassion. It's a matter of how do you expediently communicate that, and how do you how do you live your life in such a way that you're not kind of, stuck trying to come up with very cerebral understanding of queerness? How do you live in a way that's really supportive of people if you don't have quite the vocabulary or the lexicon to navigate their specific identities?
Great. So I'm curious also about your individual publishing experiences. I talked to a lot of aspiring authors today who are worried about pitching books with queer content, or specifically working with editors and publishers, and especially large publishers with books that have queer content, because they're concerned about getting pushback about the queerness in their book and being asked to rewrite or to elide parts of their story. So, how has your publishing experience been? Kat, do you want to start?
Sure. So again, I've been pretty lucky to have had a lot of those hard battles already fought before I ever started publishing anything. The first actual published work that I had in a comic book shop was through Boom Studios, and it was the queerness of that was not an issue. My editor was a lesbian, and practically everyone that I've worked with at Boom has been a woman, queer, non-binary. I've worked with people who are very excited about queer elements of stories. I've been pretty lucky in that regard. I'm always ready to fight for things, but I have found that I haven't had to, fortunately. And I always just in the back of my head, I was thinking well, if anyone has a problem with that, I'll just publish this. I'll just make a webcomic and I'll self-publish it or whatever. It's there are options out there that I have seen work for other people. So I know that there's ways to get things out, even if someone did give me grief for it, which no one ever has.
Trung, what about you?
I have also had really overwhelmingly positive experiences. This is my debut graphic novel, and you actually acquired this book, and so I didn't have any problems whatsoever about any of the wanting to tell queer stories. As a matter of fact, I'm in the middle of going through writing the script of the second book right now, and I'm okay, so these are the central protagonists. And my editor Whitney was but what if they were gay? And I was what if? Yes, indeed. And so I've had a lot of really wonderful experiences so far in creating the particular stories that I want to tell. And so right now, at least per my experiences, graphic novels and traditional publishing for long form comic books is very queer friendly.
Mike, what about you?
Yeah, it's been totally positive. I would say the first queer book that I worked on was Worm Loves Worm, with Balzer and Bray, written by J.J. Austrian. So that was a picture book. So that was my intro into that. But it's always been positive for me. And Flamer is at Macmillan. And there are queer people working there that have been so supportive, and there was zero pushback, even on the things, my agent, Brenda Bowen, recommended when I was writing. She's just don't hold back, just write everything and we'll see how it goes. And they didn't take anything out. And there are some things in the book that I didn't think it would make it in, but it did. And I think it's great. And I think that now that, as Kat was saying earlier, there were trailblazers who really fought to get their work into the world. I think now that those titles have proven out and sold, and that the publishing industry sees that there is a want for these books and a need for these books, I think people are more willing now to acquire more queer stories. And it's not oh, well, we have our gay book, so we don't need another one. I think that's been demystified now. So I think there's a lot more room at the table.
What about you, Jessi?
Yeah, I very much agree with what Mike was just saying, that it just, a lot of what we've all been talking about is, telling our, specific kind of story. And I think there's just, especially in the last couple of years, I feel like there's been an explosion of just like room for all of these different kinds of things. And yeah, I am in a similar position to Trung, that Witchlight was pretty much finished and you acquired it. And so it was like a big, check mark pre-approval for me of just like, well, she liked it as it is, and all of the gay stuff is already in there. So, and yeah, when I was working on the project that I'm working on now, pitching that, I did not have any reservations about the queer content. More my weird fantasy stuff, I was like, they're going to tell me no, they're going to tell me no, and then nobody told me no, so I just kept going. So yeah, if anybody is nervous about pitching their weird queer story, just go for it until somebody says no, and then refigure it out from there.
Great. So all of you are specifically telling stories for kids and for teenagers. What got you interested in doing a story for a younger audience? Mike, do you want to start off? I know you talked about this a little already.
Yeah, I mean, as I was saying before, like I didn't see myself in the books I was reading, and I wanted to write the book that I didn't have. Like, so when I started writing this, it was to my younger self. But as it developed, it, turned into like a message to anyone who's struggling with their identity. Yeah, and I mean, I've always wanted to write for youth. It's just a genre I feel comfortable speaking to. There's not the level of pretension that one might encounter with adult books. I'll just say that. And so I feel this freedom to have fun and not be preoccupied with trying to feel self-important. And I'm not trying to like completely knock adult books, just a little bit. But it's just what I feel most comfortable in, and this is really exciting getting to do graphic novel, because comics were what I read as a kid. Like I didn't want to read anything without pictures in it, so it really saved me as a reader. When we aged out of picture books and illustrated chapter books, and I would just spend all my lunch money on comic books instead. But yeah.
Jessi, what about you?
Like I said, I was very self-centered when I was writing Witchlight. It was for me. And when I was first starting it, I think I was around 25 or so, 24. And it's low-key very much about being in your late teens, early 20s, and like not knowing what the hell you're doing. And just like, I don't know, creating this fantasy space that, at the time I was writing it, I really enjoyed. And when I was in high school, I really enjoyed those kinds of stories. But again, like I didn't, I was getting all the pieces of the kinds of things that I wanted in media from different places, and just being able to like mash them into one big juicy ball. And it's something that if I would have found it on the shelf of my local library when I was 15, it would have been like, well, I'm checking this out 20 times over the next year.
That's the best kind of book. Kat, what about you?
Well, similar to Mike and Jessi, there's an aspect of wanting to create stories that we didn't have when we were young. Thinking about, what if I'd gotten this figured out, 20 years before I finally did, or something like that. If we had that concepts introduced to us at a younger age, it'd be like, oh, so much easier to figure yourself out. And also for our peers, so much easier to understand each other. I also am the writer and one of the writers for Lumberjanes. And so there are a lot of queer characters in that series. I wanted to have like a really short little segment where one of the queer characters just explains their they them pronouns, and in the context of the story, it was just like you introduce a concept to the other characters and they're like, okay, all right, got it, I'll figure that out. Yeah. And it's just like it's not a huge deal for the kids, which it usually isn't for kids. They're a lot more willing to accept things, and we still have panels like this where we talk about queer kids media specifically, because we still have people saying that somehow queer themes are inappropriate for kids, as though there are no queer kids out there. And that's still a concept that people struggle with. That's why there are still queer books in the banned books list, because that's supposed to somehow be inappropriate for children, which is still something that we have to, fully debunk, which we're doing a pretty good job with that. So, yeah.
What about you, Trung?
I think it's a combination of a lot of everyone else's excellent responses. Like, I think the thing that I think about a lot is that there is a conflation of queer issues with adultness that we're starting to move away from. When we tell stories about queerness, we want to tell stories about our friendships and our relationships and the fullness of our lives outside of our most intimate relationships as well. And that's something that can be made explicit in children's books in ways that I guess now aren't read as threatening anymore. And I'm not actually sure quite how I feel about that it doesn't represent a risk quite so much as something that I'm thankful for, but at the same time, it exists in this particular place in history that I'm still turning over quite a bit. But I think one of the, aside from, the freedom to just have fun and not really, edify or say anything or, sound self-important, like Mike alluded to with adult media, I think there is something in me that kind of feels, especially as like a queer man, that there is a continuity of history that I feel like I want to work inside of as far as children's media, because I kind of really feel like, especially kind of growing up in like as a queer boy in the 90s, you don't really have a lot of queer male forebears. A lot of them died off with the AIDS crisis in the 80s. So we just like lost a whole generation. And then there was this kind of cultural desire that was really homophobic to silo like young queer people away from queer adults, because we're not born into queer communities. We're born into whatever we happen to be born into, and we have to find our queer family later on. And so there's a continuity of history that just simply doesn't happen. And I think a lot about like the children's book authors that were queer, whose stories that I loved, like Arnold Lobel, writing Frog and Toad, and Tommy DePaula, who just came out last year. He died earlier this year, so he was publicly out for only 1 year of his life. And he did his best to kind of like incorporate queerness into his stories. Like in the 80s, I remember, I wasn't alive in the 80s, but I read Oliver Button is a Sissy when I was quite a bit younger. I found it in a library somewhere and I read it and I was like, oh, this is something that I deeply identify with. And I didn't realize that there is this whole kind of queer history of children's book authors who kind of kept themselves out of their stories, but put the parts of themselves that they felt that were loving and compassionate into their stories in ways that couldn't be, that could plausibly be denied. And now that we're in a space not to do that anymore, I really feel like there is this additional responsibility for queer creators to make the most of the spaces that we're afforded now to tell queer stories for children.
That's awesome. So
100.
bouncing off that a little, is there anything content in your books that's different because you're making them for kids rather than for adults? Like, how are you thinking about your audience when you're having your creative process? Kat, do you want to start off? And I'm starting off with you specifically. Your book is for middle grade, where the rest of the panelists are for high school, for young adult. So is that different for you?
When I wrote, or when I came up with the concept, at least of Snapdragon and the pitch for it and everything, I did not have any target audience in mind. Like Jessi said, I really just I wrote it for myself. I wanted to do this story, and I figured, well, if I like it, there's probably some other people that would also like it. I don't tend to think about an audience when I'm writing, because then I feel like I might even inadvertently change something or leave something out that I don't think people will be interested in, and then people are. And so you want those things in there. And so, no, yeah, I was thinking maybe, because there's a lot of roadkill in this book, I was thinking maybe that might be too gross for kids. I thought maybe it would have to be aged, or like the audience would be a little older. And they're like, no, this is middle grade. I'm like, all right. So and also when I was a kid, I was definitely one of those kids that sought out the stuff that was for older kids, because I was very curious about that and I wanted to see that stuff. So the stuff that was like maybe a little too spooky or a little too gross or a little too this or that, I love that kind of stuff when I was a kid. So I wouldn't want to, there's nothing that I have consciously left out for an audience for kids.
What about you, Trung?
I find this to be a complicated question because I oscillate between middle grade and YA in my storytelling sensibilities quite a lot. In my debut graphic novel, the protagonist is 13, so he's like quite a bit younger than what my target audience is, which is YA, but the kind of deuteragonist is his mother. And so there's this sort of like, I'm like, oh, okay, so I've averaged out to a young adult audience right here. But I don't really think about it too much. Like, my understanding of media is that a lot of the editorial decisions that, like, if I write something that might be a little bit too mature, then I'm going to get a little bit of editorial pushback, but that didn't really happen with The Magic Fish. And a lot of the foundation of the stories in the book are fairy stories, which is something that we kind of think about as a thing for children, but they're actually all horror stories. And so there's a bit of like gruesomeness in it. And, you know, with my audience being teenagers, I had quite a lot more freedom to explore kind of the darker aspects of fairy tales and the ways that we articulate our trauma in ways that maybe aren't about what they're about. And so I felt like quite a lot of freedom to explore those different things. And it might actually also be a matter of the fact that, you know, comic books lend themselves to individual pacing as well. So if you write something that's horrific, a child would be able to control the pace at which they consume the thing that's in front of them, as opposed to like a horror film where everything comes at them at once and they have no control over it. And so there is this freedom in allowing the reader to process things at their own speed in a graphic novel or in a book that you don't get with any other media. And so I think that I can write a little bit more maturely in my children's books for that reason.
Yeah. Mike, what about you?
When I was writing Flamer, I just thought about, you know, what was I interested in at 14? Like, what did I think was funny, and what was I scared of? And a great research tool to my own, you know, past was that. So I should preface that in the book, Aiden has a pen pal named Violet, and she's based on a real life friend named Lara, who the book is dedicated to. So my dearest friend Lara compiled every letter I ever wrote to her and sent them to me digitally so that I could go through like painstakingly. I mean, it was horrific reading the things that I was like, oh my God, you would not believe what happened to me today. So it was like horrifyingly hilarious. So I tried to just put myself back in those shoes of being 14 and being like, okay, well, what's important to me right now? So that was the voice I was trying to write with. Because I mean, things change, but some things don't change. You know, there's a continuum, I think, for different ages, and we're all different maturity levels at that age. But there's still some common themes, I think, regardless of what generation you're born into.
Jessi, what about you?
So as I've said, I made Witchlight pretty much for myself, but I am also one of those adults who, you know, reads books for adults, but also a lot of YA, and even beyond that, I still love picture books. I have a whole shelf over there of just children's books, and so like it all kind of gets mushed up in my head, and I don't have a specific like writing style or voice for different age groups. I kind of just like, well, I approach all of your books the same as me, so back at ya. I think the only thing that I went back and changed for like an age group reason with Witchlight was there was one whole swear in the first chapter. And that was the only swear in the whole book. And it had been in the single issue. And when I was selling it, you know, as a self-published thing, you know, I'd get moms coming up or dads coming up or, you know, whoever, and asking what age level it was okay for. And I would, you know, say like, okay, well, reading level wise, it's probably, you know, 10 and up, something like that. But I do have to warn you, there's one swear. And I was like, okay, well, you know, it's getting, you know, published as this big fancy thing. How about we take out that warning, just remove the one swear. The way I don't have to say it anymore.
Wow.
It wasn't even a bad swear. But
Okay, so I have one last question for you all, but we still have a little bit of time in the panel. So, panel audience, I appreciate you saying hi and sending us smiley faces. If you yourselves have questions that you want our panelists to ask, please send them along while we're wrapping up our last question, and then we'll cut over to you and ask some questions for you. Okay, so my last question for you all is, what's another great queer kids graphic novel that you'd recommend? Like, tell us the title, the author, and then a little bit about it. Mike, do you want to start?
Oh my God, this always happens to me. Someone asks me that question and I go deer in headlights. Go to someone else. I swear. I read other queer graphic novels. Well, actually, okay, here's one just because it's like sitting on the table over there. The third book. But I love Witch Boy by Molly Ostertag. And that's more of a middle grade graphic novel. And it's a series. And the main character is a male teenage, well, he's supposed to be a warlock, a shapeshifter. So everything's very, very binary in this like world he lives in, where like all the women are witches and all the men are like these shapeshifters. And like ne'er do the two cross worlds, but he like is not good at shapeshifting, but feels this like he's very drawn to witchcraft, and so there is this like queer undertone to everything, about kind of like crossing genders and breaking those norms and stuff like that. But anyway, I think the art's beautiful and the story is exciting and fun, and it's witchy. So I definitely recommend. So I'm about to read the third one, which is The Winter Witch.
Jessi, what about you?
So I am prepared. I recommend The Breakaways by Kathy Johnson, who, full disclosure, is my friend, but it's so wonderful. It's about a bunch of middle school kids on a very inept soccer team. And I have no interest in soccer, but I love this book so much. So you don't have to be into sports to like it. I got it from Kathy last summer, and then immediately, just like, I was on a friend's couch while a bunch of friends played a tabletop game, and I just was by myself, read the whole thing through, crying, and like happy tears, because it just, there's these crystallized moments of vulnerability with queerness that these kids have between each other that was just very, very special to me, that they were able to understand and support each other in a way that felt so natural. And I know Kathy is an educator and works with children a lot, and it just like hit me in the heart. I'm like, she's writing from life. Kids are like this now. Like, they don't have to, be brave enough to go to an adult. They can turn to their friend and say, this is what I'm feeling, and can you help me? And they can get help. And I'm gonna cry now because it's so highly recommend.
And I see that Kathy is watching this panel and says, thank you, Jessi, and sends hearts and a smiley face.
Chucks, you're great.
Yeah. Kat, what about you?
It's such a hard question because there are so many, a lot of them through First Second, so just check out First Second. I'll say Go with the Flow, just because it's at the top of my pile right now. It's about four friends in high school, and they're trying to create a menstruation revolution at their school, and trying to educate people about menstruation, and trying to make it a not taboo subject, and trying to get free tampons in their bathroom. Meanwhile, they're going through all of their teen things, and it's just a really good book. It's a great story, and then it's also a really important topic. So, love that one.
What about you, Trung?
Let's see. I have I have three. So the first one has been out for a while, and I know a lot of people have read it and loved it, but I have to reiterate that Laura Dean Keeps Breaking Up With Me by Mariko Tamaki and Rosemary Valero O'Connell is just gorgeous, and it's so beautifully written, and it's about what to do when you feel like you can't leave an abusive relationship, an abusive relationship that's abusive in mundane ways that aren't like really highfalutin. Something just always feels wrong, and it's got these wonderful, lovely, like queer central characters, and there's really sensitively done subplots as well. It's great. I'm also thinking of books that are not necessarily that don't center queerness at its core in an effort to edify, but like have queer creators whose sensibilities kind of go into their work. I really enjoyed Black Mage by Daniel Barnes and DJ Kirkland from Oni Press. That was a lot of fun. It's like a magical school, like shonen action adventure kind of comic book that contends with fantasy racism, which is a lot of fun. Like the racism is not fun, but they deal with it in a really kind of creative way. And I'm always looking for books for a lot younger readers too. And so one that came out relatively recently was the in the Babysitters Club series, there's a book called Karen's Witch. I think it's part of their like Little Sisters imprint. And that's by Anna Martin and Katie Farina. And the artwork is adorable and also lots of queer sensibilities, kind of just second nature spread throughout the stories and the books.
Thanks, everyone. Okay, so there's a question about is there a bookstore or links to buy these books, which I think is a cue for our host to put up links for all of the panelists and and their books. So hopefully those will be coming up on the screen now too. So I think this is probably going to be the first question from the audience, but also probably the last question because we only have 3 minutes left. And I'm going to put 2 questions together, which are about inspiration. So are there books that inspire you? Are there things that you do to keep getting inspired, to get to get your plots for the stories? Like how do you have the inspiration for your books and your writing and your art? Kat, do you want to start?
Yeah, just real quick. Definitely all of my myriad interests outside of comics. I pull from all sorts of different places. And also I'm really strongly inspired artistically by animation, like really good animation, traditional animation.
Trung, what about you?
In order to kind of keep myself inspired and motivated, I like to look at artwork that I really enjoy. So I'll pour through a lot of really old children's books that I grew up loving. I have a lot of, I have a Pinterest board of all the different illustrative eras that I enjoy. And I have tons of comic books and reference books. So sometimes just taking a break and consuming work keeps me motivated.
What about you, Mike?
Yeah, I definitely read lots of other comics and lots of film. But I think it's important if you're feeling blocked up to experience some joy. So that could look like an ice cream cone or singing some karaoke or doing some exercise to get your just get out of that headspace. Yeah, I do a lot of distracting and then lead myself back, I guess.
Yeah. Jessi, what about you?
Similar to what Kat said, I try to just have a bunch of sources of input that aren't comics, whether that's other forms of media or just experiencing new things. So I can just have new things to add to the jumble in my head. And especially when I was making Witchlight, but still now as well, just getting out into whatever nature I can find. It was easier when I lived in Ohio. It's a little harder in Chicago. But just seeing more natural environments and feeling the joy that comes from that for me. Anybody who's familiar with my work will know that I'm a plant fan. So it's something that that keeps me going really well, and is something that gives me new things that I want to draw because I want to see them drawn.
Awesome. Okay. Well, that is it for us on time. Thank you so much for being amazing panelists for this great discussion of queerness in kids comics. And thank you so much to our audience for coming and supporting queer kids comics because they're great and they're what's going to support the kids of today and their queerness. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
And that was the panel. Hey,
Hi
Terry.
again. Hey, thank you everyone for tuning in for that panel. I hope you enjoyed it. If you're interested in supporting any of the authors whose works you saw, we posted the links to buy the individual books, but also if you have a local independent bookstore that you'd like to support, we highly encourage that too.
Indeed. Well, the link should be right there in the comments, so feel free to click through and check it out. Next up, we have There Can Only Be One, Marginalized Creatorship and Working in Multiple Mediums. That starts at 2 o'clock, which is now.
Head on over back to our youtube.com/geeksout or facebook.com/geeksout or facebook.com/flamecon to catch the next panel.
Yes, and we'll be dropping that link in the comments right now.
All right, we'll see you there.